Good afternoon. We're gonna begin the second part of our session here. Okay, my name is Daniel Kalesnik. I'm one of the 6 teachers of the Argurments class here at the Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation and Planning at Columbia, and I'm here to present Terence Riley. Terence Riley is a curator, scholar, and writer. We welcome him back today. Columbia University, and GSAPP in particular, was once his home, since he served as the director of the Arthur Ross Architecture Gallery in Buell Hall. In 1991, he was appointed the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he organized, amongst other exhibitions, Frank Lloyd Wright, Architect, in 1994, The Unprivate House in 1999, and Mies in Berlin in 2001. Following MoMA, Terence joined the Miami Art Museum, MAM, as its director, and led the museum through the design phase of a major expansion designed by Herzog and de Meuron. He has also organized exhibitions at the Wexner Center for the Arts and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Along with John Keenan, Terence Riley is a founder of KR, Keenan Riley Architects, with offices in New York and Miami. He has also been involved in many competition juries, including the World Trade Center, the 9/11 Memorial in the Pentagon, the Reina Sofia National Museum in Madrid, and the Museum of Latin American Art in Buenos Aires. This is the second installment of our talks on exhibitions. Last week, Reinhold Marden talked about his experience as a co-curator for the foreclosed exhibition at MoMA. This week, Terence will speak to us about his role as the curator of last year's Shenzhen and Hong Kong Bi-City Biennale of Urbanism and Architecture, a very different exhibition scenario, and we look forward to learn about his experience. Welcome.
Good afternoon. This is actually the first time I've talked about this biennial. So the slides have been pulled together in actually a very documentary way. I was unaware that you've actually been doing some background study, and so I don't know exactly what I need to or should present, and so it's going to be a little stream of consciousness, interrupted by some facts here and there and observations. And when the gang of 6 feels it's appropriate to start talking, I'm happy to do so. The 2011 Shenzhen and Hong Kong Bi-City Biennial of Urbanism / Architecture, I think it needs a little decoding. I see a lot of, I actually was wondering whether anybody in the audience would have been to Shenzhen. And it looks like the possibility might be rather high. How many people have been to Shenzhen? How many people have been to the Shenzhen Biennial? Yeah, that's interesting. How many have been to Venice? How many have been to the Venice Biennial? This is interesting. This was the 4th edition. It was the 3rd edition of the Bi-City Biennial. What, you might ask, is the Bi-City Biennial? There are 2 biennial events, separately organized, but ideally happening at the same time, one in Hong Kong and one in Shenzhen. What is the backstory here? It was invented by politicians. It was an idea for how Hong Kong and Shenzhen, who don't always collaborate, are often competitive. It was an idea about how these 2 cities could work together culturally. The goal at some time in the future, and it may happen next time or the following, is that there be one curator and it gradually become one event, geographically kind of dispersed. But right now there's 2 separate ones. Jean King from Taiwan did this year's Hong Kong manifestation. Biennial. There's no biennial in the world of art, architecture, whatever, that's not referencing the city of Venice. And the idea of the Venice Biennale, I think we have to keep in mind, is an evolving idea of an exhibition. It was founded in the late 19th century, very close to the same time that the modern Olympics was founded. And like the Olympics, it was completely structured along national lines. a kind of deeper political story in, why in Venice. By the late 19th century, Italy and Venice as a city were, if there was a kind of competition, as there certainly was in the industrialized nations, in the Western nations, European nations, in terms of what country was most rapidly industrializing, producing wealth, jobs, etc. Italy was not winning, and you see the Biennale in Venice as an example of a number of events in the late 19th century Italy where Italy tries to rebrand itself as a modern country that is certainly an industrial country, but is more focused on art, culture, etc. And the fact that one of the prime movers in the establishment of the biennial was actually the mayor of Venice. It was, you could say, a very early exercise in cultural tourism. The mayor of the city realizing that its future belonged probably on a different path that it had been following. Back for a second, urbanism and architecture. It is the only biennial in the world, I believe, that includes urbanism as one of its roots. The art biennial, I don't know how much you've looked into it, but it morphed into various sub-biennials in Venice. And before there was an architecture biennial, there was the Venice Film Festival, which was a kind of offshoot of the art biennial. And now architecture starting in '79, although it's never been every 2 years. One of the worst things about the Venice Biennial was that from the beginning they have had a theme. And there's something, I resisted as much as I could this idea that I had to come up with a theme. I think the idea that any kind of critical, interesting, global characterization of what is happening in architecture and urbanism that can somehow be summed up in a slogan, I think was really not correct. And I tried to convince them, rather than have a slogan, have a symbol, something like the Biennale formerly known as Shenzhen by city, and have just some sign. But they were very keen on the notion of the biennial. So the idea, of course, was to somehow come up with some sort of a way of inviting some kind of discourse. They also wanted the theme to have the term, what's the one word everybody uses now? Sustainability, which of course has become so commercialized and crass that it's almost embarrassing to use it in this sort of context. So I tried to actually think of a sign or a theme that actually implied sustainability. And architecture creates cities, cities create architecture seemed to be quite appropriate to an urbanism and an architecture biennial. And I started to try to think of it as a sentence that didn't have an end. Architecture creates cities, create architecture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which in some ways, if things don't end, they're sustainable. So the hope was that more of that was implied than spelled out. I'm trying to remember Sejima's theme. People live in architecture or something. What is it? People meet in architecture. One of the less memorable ones, Hans Hollein suggested architects as seismographs, meaning that somehow architects have a preternatural sensitivity to shifts in cultural tectonics, etc. But this was a game that we had to play and get over it as soon as possible. One of the other political things we had to get over, this is an interesting map. We were told we could have the biennial anywhere we wanted to. That turned out not to be true. Some portion of it had to be at the Civic Square. And no matter how little of it was at the Civic Square, we had to call the Civic Square the main venue. And this is more not the Shenzhen, Hong Kong politics, but this is more the politics of the city. And what's interesting about this map, which was produced by the Biennale organization, is the Civic Square and the OCT loft area are about a half an hour away, but somehow they've been kind of presented as being almost in walking distance. And the map's interesting also because it shows all the frontier points, if you look down at the bottom of the slide, and the airport. So there was a very important exercise here in making the map. We didn't make it. This was made by the administration, and I think the emphasis was to, connect everything to the airport internationally and all the southern frontiers, which connected to Hong Kong. But the proximity of the Civic Square and the OCT area are not is an exaggeration. And the Civic Square, I don't know if any of you know this building. I mean, this is like Shenzhen 40 years ago was a city of 30,000 people. Now it's 12 million, something like that. Nobody really knows. This building is the Civic Square. If you look under this enormous roof, those glass glazed areas under the red and yellow pylons, those are 4-story buildings. I mean, this is this enormous, enormous building, and the space is as large as Tiananmen Square. And so the whole idea of trying to deal with this space was something the city was hoping that every Biennale would do. And my reaction when I saw it was simply, we can't do this. This is like such an anomaly. So we had a major series of things here anyway. If you look at these cones, these were designed by John Bennett and Gustavo Bonavardini. They wanted to do something. I mean, the horror of dealing with this space was, in a Biennale that was supposed to be about sustainability, how much waste were you going to produce trying to transform this Tiananmen Square size space? So they limited themselves with using something that was already in production and something that could be used thereafter. And so they focused on these traffic cones, which were highly reflective, and there was a nighttime part of it. And they also kind of referenced the tombs of the soldiers in Xi'an, but the more specific reference was when the Jesuits first came to China in, I think it was the 17th century, maybe the 16th century. One of the amazing things that got sort of transplanted was this garden that the Jesuits built, and it was in the form of a maze. And so, to a certain extent, the Bennett and Bonavardini were referencing both this notion of Western importation of Western cultural tropes, the idea that culture might be a kind of maze anyway, et cetera, and I think I actually think it worked quite well. I'll show you some other slides of it. And then near the City Hall, we had something called Ultralight Village. Because there was a whole podium, this was a podium, there's a whole structure below it. These structures could not have any foundations, so it was a sort of exercise in lightweight thinking as well as lightweight construction. And then OCT, when Shenzhen opened to the west, there was this place called Overseas Chinese Town. And it was an area set out by the government where they invited overseas Chinese, Taiwanese, Singaporeans, Hong Kongers, Chinese from Canada, to repatriate, to come back to China, to invest in Shenzhen in this fairly controlled kind of campus. And while the borders have all kind of dissolved, it's still referred to as OCT. And it's a bunch of really beautiful old industrial buildings, old meaning 60s, 50s. No, even later than that. Not very old. And of course, this is where anybody doing an exhibition would want to go, these big industrial spaces. Anyway, here's back at the main plaza, using this sort of stupefying repetition and maze-like characteristics. And they are highly reflective, so at night, particularly during the opening ceremony, it had a kind of fantastic urban quality to it. The Lightweight Village, structured by Obra, ironically referencing Tatlin's memorial to the Third Internationale. MOS, Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample. Wang Shu, luckily I picked the guy who got the Pritzker Prize. It would have been very embarrassing to have this opportunity to pick anybody possible and miss the Pritzker Prize winner. Young architect from Murcia, Spain, Manuel Clavel Rojo, a kind of dynamic series of umbrellas that spin and lift up and moving seating as well. Architect named Wu from Hunan, had the architecture school there. Some architects from Croatia, Studio Up, producing this almost, it was a viewing device that mirrored surfaces all around, acted as a kind of urban kaleidoscope. And then a huge, China had just passed this resolution about building all this 10,000, I think it was 10,000 or 10 million, these numbers just escape you when you're doing things of this scale in China. No, I think it was 10 million. Their goal to build 10 million affordable housing units, and this major exhibition by a Hong Kong curator put together in a very short amount of time. So, I don't want to go through and just name everything, but I think, when you're given this opportunity to do a biennial, obviously, if you think about it as, maybe think about it like a book. You're planning on writing a book. What kind of book is this? A biennial by its nature aspires to a kind of global, a global view. I mean, I think when the Venice Biennial started, it was global only in the sense, I'm sure that the first year in the biennial it was only European countries. During the post-war period, there was a significant number of Asian countries. Latin American countries were added, et cetera, to the point where it could be considered a almost global event, although I think there's very little African participation and not really representative Latin American participation. So there's this aspiration of a global kind of vision or a global representation. It's obviously not supposed to be everything. The problem with everything is that it's not interesting. The internet is in fact everything, and there's no reason to aspire to everything. As I said, it's simply not compelling as a kind of story. So the question is, if it's curatorial, if it's critical, how personal can it be and still be global, and still, maintain some sort of way of engaging the public, giving them some sort of a key. I mean, my feeling, and I think other curators in the past have disagreed, is I have a little bit of I step back when it comes to the personal. I don't think my particular view of the world is worth $8 million worth of presentation. I think highly of my opinion, and I believe in what I say and what I write. But I think given an opportunity like this biennial, it shouldn't be everything, but it should certainly be more than just what I've been thinking about. And particularly because I'm not an urbanist, so right away you're stepping out of your role and trying to make room for people who have, I guess what I would say is have points of view that are kindred, although nobody was required to pass an ideological examination to participate in this. And I should say that the structure of this was almost like academic in terms, and I mean in that sense, like a university faculty. Other curators have established teams, and the notion is that the team is responsible for the intellectual content. I actually find that one, frustrating, two, time-consuming, and when you're talking about a Biennale, it's not a book, it's a performance, it's got a date, it has to happen. And so what I tried to do, what I did do, was I tried to imagine a kaleidoscope, if you will, or a constellation of shows that had different content, and I tried to match those shows with a curator. And by and large, after kind of discussing it conceptually and maybe massaging the concept a little bit, letting those people do what it is that they do. I mean, I think in the same way that a dean is a colleague at the same time, I tried to act like a dean. You know, I tried to hire the best professors and let them do what they do. And so you'll see, I think throughout this, many different voices, and that was intentional. That was a way of trying to mimic the Venice Biennale where, yes, the chief curator is given an enormous amount of power, but that power is balanced and the event is richer and more interesting because in addition to the chief curators, there's all the curators of the different pavilions. And those curators are free to amplify the theme that's been announced, ignore it, contradict it, and it truly is something richer than hiring, you know, one person to expound at that length, you know, on what's happening in the world. So in this case, this was this favela painting project. What we tried to do here was I tried to balance out sort of professional presentations of urbanism, urban plans, and the like, with the recognition that urban planners are not the only ones who do urban things or make urban interventions. And these two gentlemen, Kohlhaas and Drehan, actually, with little more than buckets of paint, go into blighted areas and actually transform them through engaging the community in these kind of painting projects. And if you haven't seen them here, they're really fantastic projects. On the other side, a much more kind of professional, academically rigorous project. We encouraged the University of Hong Kong to adopt Barry Bergdahl's Rising Currents model of an exhibition. While Shenzhen and Hong Kong are separated by history, currency, government, many other things, it's all the same water. You know, there's no distinction. Water doesn't respect boundaries. And so this team of Shenzhen and Hong Kong architects undertook projects in 3 sites. Interestingly enough, in Shenzhen, the problem isn't just water rising, it's also water disappearing as more water is pumped out of the aquifers. So the people who could understand and enjoy the favela project might not have been able to understand this, but that's another dimension that I was reaching for, which is, in addition to being a global project, I think most biennales aspire to being an urban event, you know, and not simply a chatting session for the professions, but actually something that engages people on more levels than a kind of professional convention. We had so much space that, I mean, certain people this is Frank Habermans, an artist, architect from Holland. We were able to just sort of accommodate requests for space and give it a very unplanned and very spontaneous. This is not something that happens in Venice. There's no spare space. There's nobody who shows up at the last minute and says, can I do X? This is another project that sort of emphasizes that not just urbanists and professionals are impacting urbanism, or I should say that not just First World. This is called the Gaana think tank, and it's put together by a number of people here in New York and elsewhere. And it recognizes the fact that the First World has turned urbanism and consulting about urbanism into a kind of export economy, and frequently ignores the fact that people who live in other parts of the world specifically Gaana, where it started, but also Iran, Cuba, a number of other places, have very intelligent people who have been thinking about how you build cities for a very long time. And it's because they're not part of this global consulting economy, rarely get heard from. So this device that they designed was one of a series of designs that they've done over some time to provide a way of engaging unexpected experts about issues of urbanism. And then this was a very complicated team project. Obviously, the sponsors of this, the city of Shenzhen, hoped for, and they made it quite specific, it would be nice if there was something about Shenzhen in all of this. It would be nice if there was something that the people of Shenzhen could identify with directly. And I certainly don't think that was out of line to suggest that. But we tried to kind of not be parochial about it. And one of the events that had to do with Shenzhen was this one. It was called Cities Under 60. And it looked at the pretty much modern phenomena of building or planning new cities. And it looked at the idea of cities that were actually younger than the people that lived there. And so we started with 60 years old, and that was Brasilia, Chandigarh, all of these cities under 60, Brasilia, Chandigarh, Shenzhen. We included Las Vegas, not because it was less than 60 years old, but because its major growth moment came from legislation passed within the last 60 years. And we asked USC and Department of Architecture, Department of Film and Cinematography, and Department of the Fine Arts to work together to develop this crowdsourced project where people that lived in these cities could begin to communicate with each other. We also commissioned David Vanderleer from the Guggenheim Museum was asked to hire 6 videographers to do more kind of poetic portraits of these cities. Almere in the Netherlands, another one of them. And so this room had these touch tables where you could access all of this information. There was ability to provide input, crowdsourcing, etc. Probably the most ambitious of the projects to be done, quite frankly, in less than a year. I mean, it was a huge amount of computer coding and the like. I don't know, I could keep sort of talking about these things, but you may have already sourced a lot of this material, and maybe I'm just kind of repeating what you saw, and maybe it's more interesting to actually talk about things. This was a project called 8 Urban Plans for China. Jeffrey Johnson and Shengyong Li from Tongji University were the curators. I talked to Jeffrey about this very early on. Jeffrey is, of course, from Columbia here. As China and Shenzhen and Hong Kong are incredible laboratories for urbanism, let's look at maybe 8 lessons to be learned from 8 different projects going on in China. Everything here from Young Ho Chang's a project for Shanghai in the upper right, Stephen Hall's project on the lower right, David Chipperfield on the lower left, in a very kind of OMA and Urbanist on the lower right, James Corner upper right. Very typical kind of art show setup where everybody got the same amount of space and was required to use it, in however they saw fit. More poetic kind of installation by a non-architect, as was this piece here. Switching the focus a little bit to architecture, I think, tongue-in-cheek exhibition called Shenzhen Builds. There was a series of shows at MoMA in the 50s, Brazil Builds, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a kind of, as I said, tongue-in-cheek reference to that. But it was an example of actual buildings being built on a certain scale. This was Fuchsas's installation about the new airport, looking a lot like, when I saw these poles in the mirrors, I got kind of scared, but there were no girls dancing. OMA's installation, somewhat familiar to those who have seen various installations of their work, these tear-off sheets where you accumulate your own catalog. Urbanists, Youngho Chang, Rebirth Bricks, all doing major projects in Shenzhen. And then I think the last one, there's a project called The Street, and there was an obvious reference to a former exhibition at the Venice Biennale called La Strada Novissima, which was for any student of the years where one postmodernism sort of burst on the scene through, I suppose, its demise in recent years. Always, made some sort of a reference to this show. If you look down the center, what they did in Venice was, it was this long, narrow building, and they gave each architect a bay in the building, and they asked them to design a facade. And so those 10 facades on either side became the Strada Novissima, and we did more or less the same thing. We only had 12 facades that we, and I shouldn't even say there were 12 facades, because half of them were anti-facades, which was actually what we were hoping. What you see down the middle is videos of interviews that Aaron Betsky did with as many of the architects who participated who were still willing or alive to do that. And it was a kind of unsurprising gang in the sense that it had Robert Venturi, Robert Stern, a number of truly dyed-in-the-wool postmodernists, but it also had Frank Gehry, it had OMA, Rem Koolhaas, at a point where OMA hadn't built anything. I mean, it was a really kind of amazing selection in a certain sense. Most of these architects were actually quite young when they were selected. And then people who were kind of teetering on the edge from having been one thing and becoming another, like Hans Hollein, or the Japanese architect Isozaki, who started very much one thing and wound up being something else in not such a long time. And so we invited some architects that we hoped would be quite provocative. Aranda Lash, Hashim Sarkis from Harvard and Lebanon. As you can see, the interest in facades is quite speculative in terms of what a facade might be, whether it's a scrim with shadows or a kind of floating volume. Johnston Markley from LA, one of the firms that very much got into the rhetoric and the debate about facades and whether or not a facade is truly what made architecture. SPBR from Brazil. Mad Architecture, this huge inflatable with these little fish eyes where you'd look in and there were things floating around in the ball. Fake Architecture, what's the whole title? Fake Architecture Industries. There you go. And this was, of course, the most elaborate of all of these, where the architects claimed that these fragments here were actually fragments of the brick structure of the Venice Biennale that had somehow gotten transported, and had this fascinating kind of fable, if you will, interweaving the history of that Biennale and subsequent events, so on and so forth, including some important political events in China. So it was a thoroughly full-throated participation in that regard. Jürgen Meyer, using, I don't even know what you call it, it's one of those things you put your camera up to. What do you call those? QEDs or QEs or something like that, as a kind of facade. Li Hu, open architecture. I went to Columbia, no? worked with Stephen Hall many years, and then opened his own office there. Instead of, obliterating architecture except for these little monitors embedded behind the natural state. Mass studies from Korea also, I think, with Columbia, certainly a New York connection. So ill. Alejandro Aravena, and amateur architecture. No, I'm sorry, I have to look this one up. Can't believe that so much of this was not that long ago. But in interestingly, the vein, Alejandro Aravena, Chile had just undergone the trauma of a great earthquake, so had China. This is an architect from Jiaqin Liu from Chengdu, and he actually fabricated these bricks he called them Rebirth Bricks, made from the rubble of the buildings of the great earthquake that had happened, I think it was 3 years ago, and he began building anew with these kind of bricks in a very poetic kind of way. So you see the roof, the fabric roof sort of hanging, implying a house, and the bricks under construction. An example, this is an example of explicitly inviting different nationalities to do pavilions. This was the Dutch pavilion, Dutch being great imperialist of design, taking over the whole world. Did this huge exhibition on housing, trying to take the Dutch minimum housing standards and the Chinese minimum housing standards, merging them through a research program with Dutch and Chinese architects, and actually suggesting new prototypes. And a kind of very poetic installation. These structures used to dot the coast of Bahrain, and they were these informal little social spaces where principally men would gather to watch TV and fish and smoke hookahs and talk. And as the waterfront development exploded, these structures were one by one just sort of disappearing as they were, again, informal, etc. And somebody had a brilliant idea of trying to grab them and save them. And so there was this whole series of these structures that were transplanted here. These were also in Venice. And then in the background there were these videos showing the development of the waterfront with faceless Trump-type luxury resorts. National Pavilion of Chile, Austria, Finland, and a video that didn't translate. So I will leave it at that, and we can start the discussion. How do I make this show? No.
I think you have to be in the middle.
I have to be in the middle. What rule is that?
Unwritten rule.
What rule is that?
I make it up as I go. There was a question that was raised this morning, was a little bit how the process of selection is a bad word, but how it happened, no? And
How it happened?
Yes, it was a competition. It was.
It apparently was a competition.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know it was a competition, in the sense that only after I'd been named the chief curator and introduced to a couple of people it was explained to me had been the people who I was competing against, and I didn't know I was competing against anyone. And it was, from the government's perspective, they were doing some sort of competitive process. And there was an initial proposal that I gave that it was substantially different in terms of content, but it was fairly close in terms of intention. It was both professional and non-professional. It was both architectural and urbanist. It was a bit popular on one hand and a bit more professional on the other hand. It tried to be geographically diverse, while at the same time giving a kind of preferential spotlight on Shenzhen when that was appropriate. But the only thing that was really, it was the method that was the same in the end, not the content.
So, but it was it was an ongoing competition that no one knew about? Or?
Oh, you mean to get people into you mean how did I get the content or how did I get the job?
The job.
No, at a certain point they told me I had it.
Oh.
And, I had at that point, 15 months to do this exhibition that, I think it was in total it was something like 12,000 square feet. It was really large. It was really large. And that's a very short amount of time. The Mies in Berlin show was probably 8,000 square feet, and Barry Bergdahl and I worked on it for 3 years. So, I was talking about my fairly democratic method of bringing people on board and letting them go. It's also the only way that makes any sense.
I wanted to ask you about I wouldn't call it restaging, but about the idea of organizing a Strada Novissima in China. It's also something that came up in conversations with my students, in the sense that why the idea of celebrating or reliving it 30 years afterwards, not in the original place where it had been staged the first time, 30 years afterwards in China, and considering the fact that perhaps the term facade today in architecture to some extent is almost obsolete, but at the same time that some architects receive the commission of just designing a facade.
Now, I think there is a difference in the conception. It referred to La Strada Novissima, but it was called the street. And I think that the street has a different meaning, both in architecture, but also in politics, in culture. The street means something, and it was meant to evoke that kind of street, but play off of this very postmodern exercise and recall it. For a couple of the architects, that became grist for the mill. That whole event, the Strada Novissima, the launch of postmodernism, et cetera, et cetera. For other people, they either were unaware of it, didn't care about it, moved directly to their own interest, which, as you said, often have nothing to do with facades, or have a more complex notion of what a facade is than otherwise. But there was one element of the Strada Novissima project that predates postmodernism, and it's this idea of the Exquisite Corpse, which was a game that surrealists played in the early 20th century, and they would fold a piece of paper like an accordion, and the first artist was supposed to draw the head and shoulders, and then fold the paper over so the next artist couldn't see, and that artist was supposed to do from the shoulders to the navel, and then turn it over, and so in effect the artists were making a picture of, it was called the Exquisite Corpse, when they had no idea of what was happening next to them. And so we were also engaging that kind of surrealist exercise that had little to do actually with the substance of postmodernism. It actually, if anything, postmodernism, I think, borrowed that either consciously or subconsciously.
One of the curious things that came up in discussion, of course, was that what was really, really new about the Strada Novissima was the presence of the past, to make it even more tongue-in-cheek in the time, you know? This, you know, is a street of a city that is younger than its inhabitants, you know? So I thought, was it doing the reverse? One was finally feeding off the past. Was this segregating some past? Just turning it around? Or
That's a very good observation. I mean, the one thing about a Biennale is it happens in such, fast forward that in retrospect people have these reactions that are actually quite interesting, and I'm not sure I thought about it that way before. I mean, I did write. I do not have the. Paolo Portoghese was extraordinarily convinced of his position when he wrote that essay, The Presence of the Past. He was absolutely convinced that this was a turning point in history. And say what you want about his essay, the fact is that I think the thing that I was most trying to emulate was the risk-taking where these curators and the people who were involved in the selection, for the most part, picked people. I mean, Frank Gehry, as famous as he is now, I think the Loyola project and his house were just about the only things that he had built that were worth showing. OMA had virtually nothing built. They had Ramesthesis, they had the Irish Prime Minister's house. And, there was a lot that was appealing about that show to me, not least of which was the willingness of the curators to simply say, let's show some people that have done interesting things and see what those things look like. But I have to admit, there was no sense on my part, no sense of overweening confidence that the world is all about one thing right now. The way I think Portoghese could try to claim that the whole world was turning on this axis of suddenly rediscovering the past.
I think we should open questions to the public.
The street. What, beyond the influence of just the public and how that is addressed, and with the postmodern, the importance of that, what was the importance, or was there importance at this stage in the game for you?
Of the street as a urban typology, or as a kind of, well, I mean, anybody who spent 25 years in New York, which I had at that point, I think comes to understand the street as a kind of fundamental political, social, urbanist, spatial phenomena. And especially if you go to places where the street is not very well understood. And I'm thinking of places like Cambridge, where you always have these tricky architects trying to do funny things with sections where you're always going downstairs or upstairs. And there isn't this kind of purity of the street, and I mean that in every sense, formal and otherwise. So I think that it was an homage to the idea of the street also as a very positive thing. And, I guess in retrospect, I am realizing, especially because of the interest expressed from various people, that even to love the street, has a kind of postmodern peril to it, in the sense that, like, new urbanists have sanctified the street and the street wall, etc. I guess for me, one of the amazing conundrums is, that you take Manhattan, that in the mid-19th century was like mapped out from one end to the next with this very rigid rectangle and this very precise and unrelenting street lines, street walls, and at the time, kind of produced three types of buildings: the townhouse, the brownstone, the corner building, and then the taller avenue building. But since then, like Barcelona, another street city with a very regular plan, the most regular plans has become like the foundation for unbelievable experimentation. Whereas you get places like suburbia that are nominally supposed to be about expression and casualness and exceptionalism and curving cul-de-sacs and things like that. And while they have the aura of a kind of free-form, organic, or expressive geometry underlying them, they're places of hopeless conformity and unrelenting mediocrity. And so I do love the street. I do realize it's got a kind of potential to be subverted in a certain way, but I think that the potential of the street is still quite high. And you guys probably have thought about this more than I have, so please don't make this a one-way street conversation.
Based on some of the readings that we did of the curators for the Venice Biennale, it seems like they could take a position whether the exhibition was about cataloging current architectural trends or making some sort of argument and position. And it seemed like, based on what you said about the size and the time limit that you had, that you were sort of forced to do more, catalogs since you had so many curators and so many other projects.
Actually, I think I've never heard of the Biennale curators in Venice always seem to get hired at the last minute. And there's going to be another one this year, isn't it?
Yeah. Next month.
And Chipperfield was hired like 2 months ago or 3 months ago. But actually, the Venice, I actually had to produce more square footage. We didn't have the international pavilions to rely on to kind of create this big conversation. We actually, the team I put together actually put on more square footage of exhibitions. I know it sounds very production oriented, but it put on more square footage of exhibitions than the curator in Venice has to do. If I was to compare this to what Sejima did, Sejima did I think Sejima was, by the way, one of the best curators that Venice has had. And I think in that case, I honestly believe she did something that I would have felt uncomfortable doing, it was a very personal expression. And I know when I first started talking, I said, nobody should take $8 million to use to say what I want to say. But maybe I should realize that some artists spend a lot more money than that and to simply say what they want to say. But I think Sejima spoke as an architect. If you've seen a number of the exhibitions, sometimes curators love so many ideas they can't bear not to put every idea and every interesting project they've ever found into the show, and it gets diluted by actually getting over developed. And she had the architect's sense of how to not overcrowd things and let things speak for themselves and have them be close enough that they said something about each other, but not so close that they overwhelmed each other. There was a real kind of dialogue between projects. She actually put her own work into it, which I think shows a lot of confidence. She also freely kind of intermingled artist work who, like Tom Sachs and the artist from Korea, Do Hoo-soo, who had done artwork that was very architectural. And I thought it felt, I was actually quite jealous about that. I wanted to do something like that. But these were not secure or museum-like spaces. So I wouldn't say that we weren't trying to do a catalog as opposed to, say, a personal, because it wasn't really one of everything. It was more critical than catalog. And I would say that I don't think there was any piece of it that didn't feel like it was somehow related to another piece. But those connections weren't staged, simply because I was reluctant to think that one person could impose such a vision of what's happening in the world of architecture and urbanism on so much square footage of exhibition space that one could engineer all those supposedly meaningful connections. I don't know if I answered your question.
I have, sorry. How different, I mean, from the politics of curating in the Ross Gallery at Columbia University, to 11 years at MoMA, then to Miami and its politics, to the politics of being employed by the Chinese government to curate a Biennale. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Columbia's much worse. No, actually, there was a curator at Harry Geltzauer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art who quit to become the City of New York's Commissioner of Cultural Affairs. And somebody asked him about how it was to go from a museum to the city, and he said, sooner or later you have to get out of politics. It's interesting, if you go back to the idea of the Venice Biennale, and this notion that as it started, there was no chief curator, there were simply national pavilions. The fact was the Italian National Pavilion, because it was in Venice, because it was Italy, it was way out of proportion to all the other nations' pavilions. You know, if you go to Venice Biennale today, you come in the main gate, and on axis is the Biennale building. That used to be the Italian pavilion. And it was probably 10 times or 15 times, you know, any of the national pavilions. But, you know, at that time, all of the culture was therefore, you know, administered by ministries of culture. You know, all culture was kind of political. The U.S., I think, was the only pavilion without a governmental, there is no Department of Culture or Ministry of Culture in the United States, and to this day, the U.S. government doesn't do anything else. They stage a competition to pick the commissioner, and the commissioner is usually a private individual or a private entity. MoMA actually ran it for many years, then the Guggenheim, and now it's assigned on an individual basis. But I mean, what is politics in a university? What is politics in a country? What is politics in a museum? Obviously, I think places like universities and places like museums place a very high priority on what would be called original thinking or individual expression, et cetera. And I think governments, whether it's China or in Europe or North America, look for ideas that are more political, that is, ideas that in their minds are more expressive of the idea of a nation or of culture as it relates to a nation. So I don't think the word political and culture are anathema. I think there's obviously situations where the politics trump the cultural. But for instance, if I was to use the example at MoMA, one of the great things about MoMA was they would let you basically do an exhibition about whatever you wanted to, if you argued for it. But if you did 5 or 6 exhibitions in a row where nobody came, no one was interested, nobody wrote about them, I mean, that would not be considered a success. That would not be considered a great validation of individual expression. Or put it this way, if a museum or a university was to continue to promote people whose ideas apparently had no interest to anybody else, I think that would be kind of a misuse of funds. So even free expression has a political dimension to it. there's a desire, I think, on the parts of universities and museums to be leaders, to be influential. I don't think that if you take coercion out of the formula, I don't think it's wrong to want to be a leader or accept being a leader. People used to ask me at MoMA about being a tastemaker, and I think wanting to be a tastemaker there's something really inappropriate about that. Wanting to be a leader, trying to sort of engineer that, trying to make that happen, I think there is something devious in a certain way. However, if you are earnestly pursuing what you think is interesting, if you're even pursuing ideas you aren't quite convinced of and working them through exhibitions and publications and teaching and things like that, and people are interested and that becomes popular, I don't think that's bad. And that is, in fact, political. It's about the political world, not just the individual world. The thing about, I think you were getting to something about China, though. China actually is surprisingly, the people in the Shenzhen government were very explicit that they feel Shenzhen has terrible urban problems, that it's growing too fast, that and they very much think of the biennial as a forum to address urban problems and to make suggestions, and they very earnestly listen to a lot of criticism. One could say, it would have been a lot better if they started this process of reflection a lot earlier, before they built this city of 12 million people with a kind of overnight quality to it. But it was hardly, and it may be that the top level government just doesn't think of architecture and urbanism as that important, and they're not that worried about it. But if the question was, did I feel any, I wasn't kidding. I probably got more pressure at Columbia about content and at least people wanting to know what was going to be happening and the like than in China.
I have one question. Taking consideration all these comments from the city of Shenzhen and all this criticism that they got about the urban planning, and so I was wondering what was the resonance of the biennial, especially in the city of Shenzhen.
Well, let's talk about Venice for a second. In Venice, about 60,000, well, the show that I did that was the most well attended was the Mies in Berlin show, and it was almost 1 million people. And it was up for almost 6 months, which was a long time. About 60,000 people go to the opening of the Venice Biennale. And then in the next 6 months, only another 60,000 people go. As many people go to the opening as go to the entire show. I don't know if those are the most current statistics, but about 120,000, about 150,000. So you would think, well, how does the Venice Biennale have such an impact? And it's clearly because the 120,000, 150,000 people that go to Venice, especially the 60,000 that go to the opening, are every critic, every writer, every reporter, every museum director, every architect who's been invited. And in fact, it's probably more of a media event than anything else, if you think about its impact. Shenzhen, we had 4 times as many people go as previously, but that really put it at about the same size as the Venice Biennale, which for a city the size of Shenzhen, in the country the size of China, you'd have to say it's not a very big deal. And so I do think that numbers kind of go along with politics in a certain sense. I think that there was an earnest appreciation by the the Department of Urban Planning, who sponsors the event, and fairly high-level government people. It was the first biennial where mayors from other cities came to see it and were received officially. So I would like to think that maybe in 10 years or 15 years, that the Shenzhen Biennale might be a significantly more influential event, and it will be because it's sort of begun to go along a certain route.
But what about the issues that were raised during the biennial? Because, for example, one of the exhibitions I remember that was about, well, you have explained as well, was about very young cities in China, Shenzhen is, right? So I was wondering, because I mean, we got some articles, but of course they were in Chinese, so we didn't have the opportunity to read them. And I was really wondering if there was some discussion about the issues that were raised there.
I mean, I have to say that it sort of passed like a summer storm. When it was over, I did not continue. I mean, I got bombarded with press requests, interviews, things like that, but it truly was like a summer storm, and when it was over, it just stopped. So I can't say whether some discussion remained and was ongoing, or if it was just a kind of event that happened and didn't happen. The catalog hopefully will be wide enough in distribution to have some ongoing effect.
I wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between, I know it's very different, but the Shanghai Expo and this Biennale. Like right now, the Chinese pavilion became like this popular, almost monument for Chinese people, and it still receives a lot of visits every weekend and weekdays. So did the Biennale leave something like this to the city that people can still go, or that it relates to?
On a different scale. I mean, the Shanghai Expo was not a city event, that was a national event that received, like the Olympics, extraordinary public support. And China is also a country where if the government's behind something, it can turn out the people. I mean, either through incentives, direct subsidization, et cetera. And so I think it's very hard to compare them. The lightweight village remains, and those pieces have been and will be, I'm told, redistributed around the city. But you know, it's sort of most biennials are very ephemeral affairs. I mean, they're more like events, of course, than permanent architecture, which is, I think, why, particularly for that project that turned into the maze of 10,000 flowers with the cones, you know, anybody who's really worried about and really thinking about these things is realizing it's not a building, it's not the built environment, it's really an event. And how do architects and urbanists think through events in an architectural and urbanistic way? And how do they forget things like permanence, foundations, and still convey architectural or urban ideas?
I just have a quick question about the exhibition by itself. Don't you think that instead of those orange cone or flower, for example, you use 1,000 of them in front of the open space for the exhibition, you could use a parameter or module from the Asia, or more precisely from the Shenzhen by itself, to show all those differentiations that you said, you know, in terms of governor, currency, or even the urban, you know, problem, instead of those orange cones, which is not necessarily, you know, related to the China.
I mean, I selected Bennett and Bonavati because, you know, a lot of times I knew many of the people that I selected, and part of it was knowing that I knew they were going to do something, that they had the experience. They did the Towers of Light and arranged that whole thing. So that's an example of thinking like an architect, but acting more like an event planner or stager or something like that. And so that's why I had selected them. They, I would say, dabbled with some more culturally inflected ideas, but began to feel unsure of being two guys from New York coming into Shenzhen and doing something Chinese. And so they actually got impressed with the cones, though, when they realized they were made in Shenzhen, the factory city. And they documented the whole process. They went to the factory. The guy said, "How many do you want?" He said, "We need 10,000. When do you want them? We can have them next week." So there was something extraordinarily Chinese about the whole thing. The whole idea of asking for 10,000 of these to be made in a week is something that only happens in Shenzhen. I mean, how many of you have iPads, and they're all from Shenzhen? I mean, this is where all these things come from, and it's not small scale production. It's enormous. The thing about leads into a different question, though. What pressure was there to include Chinese architects in general and have it be more culturally inflected than just a traveling gypsy, show? And, I have to say I'm very happy that this happened at a time where there is a generation of Chinese architects. There was I never felt like I was stretching it to include Chinese architects, whereas I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have been hard. Young Ho Chang, who was he dean or chairman at MIT? I mean, whatever title they use there. He opened his office in China in 1997. It was the first private architecture office. Up until that point, under the central planning, if you were passed the test where you got into architecture school, and if you graduated from school, then you went to work for one of these big technical institutes, for the most part, and some of these had thousands of people working for them, and they were the state-owned architecture entities. And they were actually owned by the universities, so there was a very complex interrelationship between education and employment. And it's really been in this 15 years since Young Ho Chang opened his own office that there has emerged a profession of young architects. And so in one sense it was very exciting to be able to kind of showcase those people as the moment they were beginning to do really exciting work. But in the case of the big plaza, it was two Americans, and it had more to do with my anxiety about making sure it was something that could happen.
So do you think that it was a successful interactive space in a, country like China?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that it was a successful interactive space there?
I'm sorry, I can't
Successful.
understand. Was it successful? Actually, you should have seen the opening ceremony, and I don't know why the thing wouldn't work, but these, as they were setting up this maze, and working through some of the formal issues, they were confronted by a lot of rollerbladers and skateboarders who were kind of upset with what they had to contend with. So they enlisted them all, and they asked the skateboarders to contact other skateboarders and rollerbladers. And the opening ceremony was this whole plaza was invaded by unscripted and unchoreographed skateboarders wearing dark clothes and with the same reflective tape as the cones. And for the ones out here who maybe are from China and have seen these official ceremonies, they're usually really scripted and really formal and very, uninspiring in a certain sense. And this was kind of chaotic and wonderful. And it was a kind of interesting mix between very official and being extraordinarily freeform. So it was interesting. And I think it was appreciated.
I would like to ask you about another issue that came out in your presentation. That it's that you show some interest in the fact that you show some interest in showing pieces of work that had to do with the fact that architects and urbanists are not necessarily the only source of producing the city, right? So, and we can find actually the same interest in other biennials. For example, in the next Biennale of Istanbul, curated by Joseph Grima with the theme of adocracy as well. And I was wondering if this is an issue that you've been developing lately, or if this is something new that you would like to develop further later on.
I have been thinking about it, and I have to say that the kind of thinking that you do to put together one of these biennales, it is kind of fast forward, and it's intense, and it's quick, and it's compressed, but it does then have a kind of long afterlife. And I've been thinking about it. And actually, one of the things that really struck me, I've been living in Miami, which has some very nice things about it, and some, like right now, I'm so glad to be up here in the cold weather. But one of the weird things that's really impressive about what's happening in New York is these weird and unattractive and not very intelligent new public spaces where they've taken just chunks of Times Square and chunks of Madison Square and kind of paved them with some stuff to differentiate it from the street, plopped down these planters that are really horrendous looking, and put chairs and table. It's the least intelligent and probably the most radically intelligent way of starting a park. Essentially what they've done is, I think they're sort of saying we don't have the money right now, but we're going to claim all this territory. This territory is now public, and we're going to get the cars out of there. And I just realized after seeing about 3 or 4 of these and how well they're used, they will never be turned into traffic areas again. And sometime in the generation of you guys, you should probably, why doesn't Columbia stage competition to turn these islands into permanent pieces of the urban fabric for young architects? I can't say I fault Bloomberg at all for this cheapo strategy, because I think it 20 years from now, it'll have an amazing effect. And that's an example, quite frankly, of a bunch of bureaucrats with no money and no design sense, probably having a bigger impact on the future of urbanism in New York than the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars that have been done on studies about trying to appropriate and recreate new parks that have just sat on the shelf and nothing has happened to them. So, and actually the crowdsourcing part of the Cities Under 60, that was really important because it invited anyone who lived in those places or anyone who accessed the project online, and it still lives online through USC, to talk about their city. And a lot, some of the things I saw were, people in Chandigarh and people in Brasilia talking about, just no place to hang clotheslines, and just, really a point of view about the city. I'll tell one more story, and I might be talking too much. I got a big shock at MoMA when the first show I did there was Frank Lloyd Wright, architect. I inherited that show. I finished it. I enjoyed doing it. I met with the publisher at MoMA to talk about the title and the cover and all those issues that affect sales. And architecture books aren't profitable, but hopefully not make it a disaster. And I wanted to call it Frank Lloyd Wright Architect. That's the way he always signed his name. It was supposed to be a full life retrospective. It made sense. It was not a thematic show. It was about his full life. The next show I did was the light construction. And when I went to the publisher, it had a much more complicated name. Lots of colons. Lightness, transparency, and translucence in contemporary architecture, positions, reflection. It was one of those Columbia Journal titles. And he said that, I said, how many books do you think you're going to print? And he said, probably not very many. And I said, why? He said, well, for one thing, people, if the word architecture is in the title, people won't buy it. And, you know, I was quite shocked. And I said, why? He said, because people think that architecture is a specialty, a technical specialty. And, you know, this was a big insight for me. And I wondered, how much are architects responsible for this? You know, it used to be in the days of classical education that knowing something about architecture was expected of every educated person. And so how did we get to the point where educated people, the people that buy books, won't buy books about architecture? And so I kind of fought back, and you guys might notice, I never put the word architecture in the titles of my shows. Light construction, that became light construction. I wanted to talk about architecture and domesticity, that became the private house. I wanted to talk about tall buildings, that was tall buildings. Virtually every show, Mies in Berlin. And what I tried to do was combine it with an image on a cover that explicitly said architecture, but the title didn't. And it actually worked. I mean, there was better attendance, there was better sales of books, and it says something about architecture. I mean, how important is architecture if nobody's interested in it? If it goes off of the table, if it only happens in Wood Auditorium? And I do think that architects have a duty to make their work more accessible and more interesting to people if they want culture and society to support it. Right now we're looking at a moment where the New York Times doesn't really have an architecture critic anymore. The New Yorker, after 60 years of having an architecture column, doesn't have one anymore. And you could say that architecture is less discussed in the most important publications that it has been in a long time. And I think that's a big problem. Part of it's architects' fault for not promoting architecture and talking to other intelligent people about it. Yeah.
Which architect has, it seems also to be a moment in which architects have achieved status of celebrities, though, no? So in which even the discourse about architecture is not so present in intellectual discussions. The figure of the architect himself is called everywhere as an important figure. And I want to tie back this thing to actually a question about the street. One of the comments that we discussed for a long time in the discussions in class was the difference between the two streets, the fact that the two streets, the Strada Novissima and the street, one having a consistent facade that define a clear, let's say, street space, clear public versus the other side, and the street not being a street. I mean, really difficult. It was really difficult to actually read as a street, not only because it was a row of columns in the middle, but because what you get, it was a series of kind of niches. When someone will display some kind of object, singular piece that didn't have the kind of ability to construct some kind of communal facade, some kind of discourse, not discourse, but something that will define that public space. And when you were talking before about how actually Times Square has been constructed as a public space without the necessity of bringing some architects, even though I think now it's Noeta is going to pave everything with some nice stones or something. I was wondering if actually, have you think about that condition? Because I think it was some kind of consistent comment for a lot of students, that difference.
I actually think almost every architect played around with the idea that of almost subtraction of facade to the point of dissolution of the boundary, but I think that almost everyone dallied and stayed fairly close to that boundary. I think there still remained a fairly clear moment where if I step over that line, I'm inside. And some of them, I think, worked at it quite hard to have both a facade and an interior and a kind of ambiguity between what was in and what was out. No? You don't think so?
No, well, our facade was kind of diagonal, so it depends if you look from one side or another. But it wasn't so much about the actual construction, the actual definition, but that when you look at the images of the Strada Novissima, it's so obvious that it's so obvious that there is a street there. There is, and you see the street, and some of the students were actually claiming that the street was a great reflection of how Chinese cities work. So actually, the street in Shenzhen was perfect because the Strada Novissima was Venice and the street was Shenzhen. In the way it configured the public space, or in its kind of newness or inability or difference from the kind of historical city in European historical city versus the kind of Chinese new city, in which a series of singularities that deal with the idea of facade completely different in each of the cases define a sort of convoluted public space that is harder to read.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that you have to take into account, though, in establishing this kind of a dialogue between Venice 30 years ago and this expression is the emergence of another way of thinking about public and private, other than the kind of Noli plan in-out facade being a barrier in that sense. And that would be the emergence of the idea of the facade as a kind of permeable membrane of sorts. And I think even, and I'm talking about something more than simply even a glass facade, because I think a glass facade in its kind of permanence, well, let me take a step back a little bit. I think what's more important than this notion of a glass facade and that kind of transparency is the fluctuating amount of information that affects your perception once you start thinking of a facade as being a communicator of ideas and a threshold or a membrane that can define inside and outside, but also allow a kind of subjectivity going on between what's supposedly private and what's supposedly public, that may or may not kind of react explicitly or be expressed explicitly in the notion of a facade. And I think you have to include that third possibility, that third idea, which actually was occurring inside your pavilion, but could have easily been happening at the threshold and helping to define not only inside and out, but then and now and here and there. And I think that the team that most aspired to that was Aranda Lash, but they didn't. Lesson number one for you future biennial participants: you always have to go and set it up yourself. You can't do it long distance. You have to do it yourself. And they had this aspiration that they would have these amorphic objects hanging in the space, but it would pinpoint lights on them. The resultant shadows on the scrim facade would take the shape of the projects they wanted them to be. It was just amorphous. It didn't ever get to that point. But I mean, they were clearly thinking of the facade as a transmitter of information. One of the symposia that we had here was, and this was an alliance when we had it at MoMA, because the exhibition creation was so absorbing, we would work with Columbia to have the follow-up seminars and symposia. And I remember one of the speakers for the light construction symposium, one of the central themes that I developed in that book was that meaning in architecture had shifted from forms to surfaces. And this is also important for facades, because if facades are skins, and skins are taking over a lot of the province of meaning in architecture, then a street of facades can be something quite different than a postmodern moment. And one of the biggest compliments was Mark Taylor from Williams College compared light construction to another show that was at the Drawing Center, which was a show about tattoo art. And it was all these style books that tattoo artists have, you know, roses and things like that. But he said both exhibitions are about information in skin. They're both about information in the surface. And in that sense, I think the street is in a three-way dialogue. And I think that what's happened since the Strada Novissima has opened up whole new possibilities for facades that make it possible to simply ignore Portuguese if you want to, or not know about him, because there is actually, I think, another way.
Yeah. Was not so much referring to specific facades, but actually, let's say, the Strada Novissima reinforces the traditional model street in historical cities. The model that you explained of facades being a membrane, the question will be like, does it imply a new form of street? Does it imply a different urban organization? That's what I was saying, like maybe that's a Shenzhen street, but because those facades are different, the urban conditions that they define therefore have to be different.
Yeah. I think it was less than valorizing traditional facades in their relationship to traditional streets, was valorizing the street as a democratic, self-directed public space, the space of the flaneur, the space of the true kind of public. So it didn't rely on the traditional facades to validate the positive values of the traditional street. And by that I mean like the streets of Barcelona or the streets of New York. Very much streets, you know, very little elaboration of this amazing, you know, series of grids and street corners. And one could argue unimaginative in its own creation, the grid of Barcelona or the grid of Manhattan. But surprisingly, this kind of platform for astounding diversity.
Yeah. I mean, just following on that, perhaps there was a reason why why the Strada Novissima looked like a street, and it's because Paolo Portoghesi really set the rules, so those projects would look like as a street. So I mean, when you read the project, it's full of regulations they have to comply, constraints, all this kind of stuff. I was wondering if you did the same with the street, and
actually. Part of what, you're correct, and what Portoghesi thought his plan as curator, and of course all curators are obsessively trying to figure these things out, Cinecittà had some kind of technology that allowed for the creation of like billboard-sized photographic enlargement processes. And so Portoghesi got onto this idea, and it's my impression, I was there and I don't remember it as clearly as I should. Most of them were these flat photographic enlargements of drawings. Although some of the architects actually, as they do in Venice, they get kind of, can't stop them, did three-dimensional, and I'm trying to remember who did. I think Hans Hollein. Was he the only one? How many historians
I
are in
think
the
the-
audience?
I think the
This is one of
ground.
the least well-documented, most important shows ever, and the fact that we don't have such great memories is critical.
I think Grau Studio also did something like that.
Was the ossuary, it looked
The
like
niches on the wall.
a columbarium, is that what that is, the word is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And in fact, Frank Gehry's was a sketch. It was just, it could have been a napkin sketch that he was sent that was blown up to the scale of 5 feet by 5, no.
I think it's not
15 feet by
9.5
15 feet,
meters.
5 meters by
5
5
meters.
meters, something like that. It also had very much to do with the space. And, the space was a provocation. It was big enough to almost be architectural. And the space in Shenzhen, it was pretty big. It had that.
But then if there were not those sets of regulations for the Shenzhen street, in a way, do you think that reflects, in a way, the incapacity of town planning, of urbanism, to set the contingencies, to set the constraints for architecture that we are witnessing nowadays? In a way, it's the failure of town planning.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's a very provocative question. I mean, I'm glad that Jeffrey Johnson took the task of coming up with the 8 plans for China and theorizing them and presenting them as a kind of précis of different possibilities and things like that. Because, despite the huge growth of cities in China, I personally would have had a hard time coming up with 8 successful urban developments. And there does seem to be something in the way we're building cities, and it's very evident in China, if only because they're doing it so fast and so big, that we're having such difficulty. This was also one of the reasons to look at Brasilia, Chandigarh, Almere, this city in South Africa, so on and so forth. And it was to sort of give them a report card. What are these cities like? Most, as it turned out, in looking back at these planned cities, the ones that were successful were almost never successful for the reasons the architects and planners expected. Almost all of them somehow became cities more or less in spite of themselves. And it had a lot more to do with the people actually living there than otherwise. Although I have to say, Brasilia, Lucia de Costa, is it? Lucia de Costa?
Costa.
And the other planners actually did seem to have learned something rather importantly from the way people were living in Le Corbusier's unité, habitation, and I found much of what had happened there much more livable than elsewhere. And, part and parcel of La Strada Novissima and Portuguese was, of course, Charles Jenks' criticism and his definition of postmodernism, part of which was always a criticism of Brasilia. And it was a criticism based on comparing it to Rome or Paris. And only after visiting Brasilia did I realize what a bit of dishonesty that was. Because, of course, comparing a 20th century city to Paris or London is going to, especially if you're predisposed to traditional architecture and traditional city planning, that's going to produce a negative comparison in any case. And when I realized after visiting Brasilia and a couple of these other planned cities was the only thing you can really do is compare cities like that to unplanned cities, the contemporary unplanned city. Compare Los Angeles to Brasilia. Compare sprawl, Atlanta sprawl to Srinagar. Those are the comparisons that I think are critical and actually mean something, rather than comparing Brasilia to Paris. It makes no sense.
So we want to thank Terry. Oh, sorry.
What do you think is the relation between Hong Kong and Shenzhen in terms of architecture and urbanism? And how does that influence the design of the exhibition?
Hong Kong has this very peculiar landscape that if Hong Kong was flat, it would be really horrible place. And didn't have a harbor, it would be really horrible place. Hong Kong has just this unbelievable majesty that as a city that is 90% topography and water. I mean, it's just a spectacular place to live urbanistically. It's actually an interesting pairing with Shenzhen, because the one thing that you walk away from Shenzhen with is, particularly if you spend a certain amount of time in the central business district and in the more recent parts, is Hong Kong and Shenzhen are really far south. I mean, they're almost, to Vietnam. They're the very southern part of China. In Hong Kong, you have absolutely no sense of this, because there's so little garden, there's so few gardens, there's so little green. As soon as you cross the border and go into Shenzhen, one thing that you're just astounded by, especially if you're from Florida, you recognize it, is just like unbelievably lush green environment. Palm trees, these monstrosos, all these plants that you associate with a tropical climate. Hong Kong is fairly obliterated, except for the water. It's recognizable flora and fauna in terms of positioning itself. I mean, it looks Manhattan-like, but I'm sure it is much further south than Manhattan than say even Miami is. I mean, I'm sure it's quite far south. Hong Kong's not a model for almost any other city, though. I mean, it's such an improbable. Nobody would, only because of this peculiar political situation, would people colonize, literally, a piece of topography with so many difficult, such a steep slope. How many people have been to Hong Kong? I mean, the number of 60-story towers is astounding, and 60 stories is now the kind of minimum height for a developer to make money. It's like nothing you've ever seen. The number of towers on tiny pieces of property, so-called needle towers, is amazing.
I believe you're the first Western curator for the Biennale, and how that made a difference, and also going back to street portion of exhibition.
What was the second part of the question?
Oh, street.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the progress order are very politically loaded, and if that has anything to do with non-Asian or non-Chinese curator.
Interesting joining of questions. I think one of the reasons I was selected as a curator, and it's interesting because this year Hong Kong picked a non-Hong Kong curator. They picked a curator from Taiwan. And I think that, I don't know, this I'm speculating on, but I think that despite the fact that the powers that be that approved the conception of the Hong Kong, Shenzhen Hong Kong Bi-City Biennial, and who pay for it, I think it's not that their top priority is architecture and urbanism, but amongst priorities, architecture, urbanism, and this desire to promote a joint Shenzhen, Hong Kong project instead of always competing. I think they were kind of surprised to realize that as long as Shenzhen appoints a mainland Chinese curator and as long as Hong Kong appoints a Hong Kong curator, the two events are in fact competitive. And I think hiring a non-Hong Kong and a non-mainland Chinese curator this time is moving one more step towards having a single curator. And I think for there to be a single curator, it can't be a mainland Chinese and it can't be a Hong Konger. That would be too politically difficult, or one of each. But I don't think they'll do that either. So now in terms of the street, I mean, I never thought of it that way, honestly. But there is, and the street had not quite gotten that kind of sensitivity, the term the street. The Arab Spring had not happened yet. That phrase, the street, or street credibility was part of the notion, like urbanism as a kind of on-the-ground phenomena. But the notion of the street as having a kind of political connotation hadn't really happened yet. And, you know, it must be said, I think I had an easier job, by the way, than my predecessors, who were mainland Chinese, who, since I couldn't understand what anybody was saying, I just kept doing whatever I wanted to do, and I couldn't go to all those meetings, so it worked out okay.
In taking on the discussion of urban vitality and sustainability in your curatorial statement, I just wanted to know if you had any ethical position. That's why being in Shenzhen, that's why you included this in your statement.
Ethical position? Yeah, well, I think I try to have an ethical position as often as I can. I didn't mean to make fun of sustainability, if that's what you think. If I didn't want to be flip about that. It's hard to be asked to include the word sustainability in 2011 when it's now being used as a way of selling cars and laundry detergent and you know. And I did write, I don't know what the ultimate difference between the word like sustainable and vital is, but there's at least enough sound bite difference to maybe try to shift some meaning from one to the other. And I do think if there's a possibility of redefining vital as something that incorporates sustainability, then it might be better for everyone. And I would like to think, if I was going to redefine it, that the term vital not only incorporated sustainability, but emphasized culture in a way that sustainability doesn't. I mean, sustainability comes across more or less now as a series of numbers, thresholds, etc. And I think vital can be considered a more abstract concept that has more to do with urbanism than simply statistics. I don't take this lightly. I mean, I did refer to this book. I can't remember the title right now. The guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was an analysis of the way European culture spread around the world. He also wrote a book where he detailed all of these disappeared cultures. There was a culture in Danish culture in Greenland. There was Easter Island. There's a whole series of cultures around the world that have the Incas, the Maya, the Incans who have basically disappeared. And his thesis is that in the period immediately preceding their disappearance, they developed practices that were that typified extreme disregard for the environment. And that his opinion is that the wisdom of the ages usually is something that preserves and protects and thinks about the environment, and that at these moments where that wisdom's lost and people begin to live flagrantly in opposition to intelligence about the environment, it's the last step before these cultures disappear. I don't think that's impossible to imagine today. As far as ethics and working in China, it's above my pay scale. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I met a lot of very interesting people, and I learned something about one of the countries that is going to have a lot to say about urbanism and architecture in the future.
So, thank you so much.
This was much more difficult than the usual talk for an hour and a half, and everybody can't wait to leave. And you get a few polite questions, and then everybody goes for dinner. But I want to thank all of you because, like I said, this was like a thunderstorm, and it just happened. It was crashing and raining and lightning and thundering, and then it all stopped. And it's actually the first time I've talked about it since December.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.